Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and Mount Auburn Hospital, I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first Thursday morning talk of 2021 with Nathaniel Philbrick. In just a moment, I will turn you over to Myra von Turkovich, who will be introducing our program this morning. But first, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First of all, I just want to say that Harvard Bookstore is really thrilled to be able to be a part of this special program that's been going on for quite a while, but now here we are in this new virtual world, and we're just so glad to be able to help out and be a part of this. Today's talk will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speaker at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. In just a moment, I will post links in the chat to purchase Nathaniel's books from Harvard Bookstore. Now, more than ever, your purchases support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. They do. We'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to turn things over to Myra von Turkovich. Myra, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you, Serena. And thank you so much.
Looks like maybe Myra is frozen. So I'm just going to give her one moment. It seems like possibly Myra is frozen. So Jeanette, maybe you would be able to join us on screen. These are these technical issues that I mentioned earlier. Myra will join us when she's able.
I would be happy to join you on screen. Thank you very much. And we'll wait till Myra gets her technology straightened out. But in the meantime, I'm here to bring you greetings from Mount Auburn Hospital. I could not be more proud and more pleased to be with you this morning and to, again, carry on our great tradition of TMT, Thursday Morning Talks. We would never let a pandemic stand in the way of us holding TMT. So I'm glad to be with you virtually, I know, and I hope in the future we can be together in reality. But again, we'll have to do with virtual and enjoy this series in that way. On this beautiful morning, again, a beautiful morning, as we often have with TMT, we find ourselves in the midst of a very serious second surge of the coronavirus. And the reality is, as much as we really, the number is hard to imagine, we have lost over 12,500 lives already in Massachusetts to the COVID virus. So again, and that number regrettably continues to grow because we are really seeing a very strong second surge in our area. And I just want to say that the second surge is a little different than the first. We have more experience this second time around. However, I think we have a more virulent form of the virus, and again, seems to be a little bit more catchy than the last one was. So again, please continue to be very diligent. Please continue to respect hand washing and mask wearing and social distancing and all of those things that have been recommended to keep us safe. We remain open. Our surgical service is again open, which is different than the first surge when we really kind of collapsed and closed everything. The ER is open, the surgical service is open, as well as the all the primary care and specialty offices. So that's different this time around. And it's mostly due to the fact that we've gotten our testing back much better. Everyone is pre-tested and regularly tested for outbreaks. And of course, more recently, we saw the light. We saw the teeny tiny light at the end of the tunnel as the vaccines began to be distributed. And that wonderful light at the end of the tunnel is carrying us through today, giving us hope and giving us inspiration for taking care of the patients who are in-house and throughout our network. We started the distribution of the vaccine as soon as we got our first supply. We've now vaccinated approximately 2,000 physicians, nurses, and first responders, including respiratory therapy, ambulance workers, et cetera. And we're working now on second doses. So as you know, the vaccine comes in 2 stages. The first is your initial injection, and then the second is about roughly 21 days later, when you will need a second dose. And we're second dosing now the staff that have been first dosed over the last few weeks. So the same thing is going on in long-term care facilities. Many of our partner long-term care facilities are now able to give the vaccine, and particularly to those in high-risk groups, such as those over the age of 80, and as well as folks who have had significant comorbidities. And while I know I don't have a lot of time here, but I do want to let everyone know that we have been thinking beyond just the pandemic to a lot of the programs and projects at Mount Auburn. And as I believe I talked about last year, we have now completed and are ready to cut the ribbon next week on our new acute care neonatal nursery, a 10-bed private room neonatal nursery for infants with, again, some degree of illness and their parents, so that they can be with parents in a much easier and a much more relaxed environment than they had before. So we're pleased to add this to our OB and neonatal pediatric service, and we're excited about cutting the ribbon next week. Second project that is really underway in a big way is our healing garden. And many of you are familiar with the Healing Garden project, many donors, as well as the fact that the TMT funds raised today will go towards that project. The Healing Garden is really pretty much staged out and up on top of the roof of one of our buildings. And many of you will be participating in this spring in the opening of the Healing Garden. So hoping for good weather, and in the spring we will present and cut the ribbon on the Healing Garden. And then finally, the biggest project just beginning, and one could not argue that this is a critical project for us, and that's the expansion and the redevelopment of our emergency department. And again, no time did I feel that this was more right and more important than the last few weeks, when we've had such a surge, a second surge. And again, we recognize the importance of having a really top drawer emergency department in Cambridge. So I thank you for your support. I thank the Harvard Bookstore for their incredible continuing support, and also for their presence this morning to help us bring you this talk. Second, I'd like to thank Amy and thank Myra for their leadership on the TMT, and they've put this together, and I am so grateful to both of them for their involvement in Mount Auburn and in our auxiliary. And finally, to Dale Manukin, who again unfailingly puts together a wonderful group of speakers every year, and we celebrate her today, along with Harvard Bookstore, Myra, and Amy. And so thanks to all, and stay safe, stay vigilant, stay masked, and stay healthy. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, Myra, excellent. Welcome back.
You know, Nat told me that there would be a
Oh, hey, seems like maybe we've lost her again. Oh, here you are again.
Can you turn yours off? Okay. So thank you, Jeanette. I didn't hear your words. I look forward to talking to you later and finding out the update of what's going on at the hospital. Today, it is our pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Nat Philbrick. Nat is a historian and prolific writer who lives on Nantucket Island. Among many of his achievements, Nat has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the year 2000 winner of the National Book Award for his nonfiction piece In the Heart of the Sea, the founding director of the Nantucket Maritime Institute, and a research fellow at the Nantucket Historical Association. We owe his appearance with us today to my mom, Donna Tillotson, who befriended Nat and his wife, Melissa, when they moved to the island in 1986. Nat, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Myra. It's really great to be speaking on the behalf of your organization. It's great to have Harvard Bookstore involved. And for me personally, it's a debt of gratitude to Donna, your mother Donna, and her past husband, Ted Tillotson. Donna and Ted were real role models for Melissa and I. Melissa was a lawyer when we moved to Nantucket in 1986. And their friendship and example meant a lot to us then when we came to the island with two children, 1 and 4, without ever having spent a summer or any time on the island. So we're probably one of the few people who live on Nantucket who their first experience was in the off season rather than the summer. And I think for a year-rounder Nantucketer, it's not a bad thing. I don't, like many people, don't have that perfect summer when I was 17 that the rest of my life will never measure up to. But it is a great place to live, and hearing about Mount Auburn's dealing with this terrible virus. Obviously here on Nantucket, we are an isolated island. My wife Melissa's on the board of the Nantucket Cottage Hospital, and the virus is raging here. And we are obviously dependent very much on off-island resources. And so it's a scary time. And Nantucket, which has been one of the themes of all my books, is I think there's something about islands that they intensify things. I think there's no accident that Darwin developed his theory of evolution after observing on the Galapagos Islands. Islands intensify trends that you see on the mainland, and I think Nantucket has been that kind of almost a microcosm that is almost an amped up version of that great big country to our left. But I don't know about all of you, but I will talk about the stated subject of this, my books, In the Heart of the Sea and Mayflower. But being a historian and having spent the last 2 years working on what will be my next book coming out next September, Travels with George, in search of Washington and his legacy. I've been thinking about the presidency, office of the presidency. This is a book in which my wife Melissa and I and our dog Dora followed George Washington's travels as president. As soon as he became president, he realized he was the leader of an already divided country. People didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as Virginians or from Massachusetts. And so he went on a road trip that took him all the way to Kittery Point, Maine, to the north, and all the way south to Savannah, Georgia. And he didn't travel by Air Force One. He traveled by carriage. And so Melissa and I have spent the last 2 years following George, and the research has been intense. I've been contacting the historical societies and libraries in just about every town he visited, and trying to find what signs of that, of George and that visit are still out there. And it's really, it's been a process by which because all my books are a process of learning. I don't write these books because I'm an expert in the topic. I write these books because I have questions about our past, about our history that I haven't found answered. And so I really wanted to, my last 3 books have been a trilogy about the American Revolution, Bunker Hill, Valiant Ambition about Benedict Arnold in Washington, and ending with In the Hurricane's Eye about Yorktown and the naval battle that preceded it. And I realized I couldn't leave Washington there. I wanted to find out what happened when he became president. And so that's what sparked this 2-year journey. And I won't go into any more detail about it unless there's some questions about it afterwards. But this was, we followed Washington's journey, and the Southern tour was the longest. It was 3 months. And he then ended up returning to Philadelphia, which was then the temporary capital of America. He was in the midst of working up what would become Washington, D.C. And we in our final tour of Philadelphia, we were in a carriage with I was in a carriage with my wife Melissa and our dog Dora, and we passed Congress Hall, where Washington was reputed to have delivered his farewell address from the balcony. He never did deliver it from the balcony, but he did publish it in 1796 in September to inform the people that he was not going to run again. He had served 2 terms very reluctantly, and he wasn't going to do a third, but he wanted to leave with a statement of what he most prided himself about this country and what he most feared for its future. And I have to say, yesterday afternoon and last night, while I was watching the events we all watched unfold, words from Washington's farewell address echoed in my head with an immediacy and a power that I just found overwhelming. And I'm just going to read this section, just a few sentences really from the farewell address before I then shift gears and dive into another portion of the past. But what feared Washington the most, very prophetically, was what would happen to America if a president's chief priority became not the Union. And that was the whole reason behind this journey, was to create a union of states, not 13 individual states, but a union. What he feared most was if a president's priority became not the Union, but an attempt to divide the Union. This is what he feared most. And this is what he would say. He said, "It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration." This is what fomenting divisions does. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. And so I would suggest we are living Washington's worst nightmare. And hopefully the union he created at the beginning will prove durable enough to get us through that. And, it's often said that we need to study the past so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And I'm afraid if writing these books about the past has taught me anything, it's taught me humility. We do not, yes, we can see what went wrong in the past, but when we're living life, we're in the middle of the moment, where we are. It's the fog of war. It's the fog of, we can't see beyond our own panicked selves to realize the mistakes we're making. This will, can you imagine 100 years from now, when they look back, they will say, what were they thinking in the years up to 2020? And the problem, and you can see an accident coming, but the American people have to live it before they can come to terms with it. And this is one of the things Washington said. He had, he said of the people, we will get it wrong now and then, but ultimately we will find the path, and hopefully we will find the path. All right. Now to change directions completely, well, not completely, because one of the things I try to do with my books is, what interests me really when I look back on, what is it I'm writing about? And what I find most fascinating are those dark moments of crisis. It's the crisis moments, and what people do in the worst of times, particularly when it comes to issues of leadership. And in the two books I'm going to talk about today, that's really, when I think about it, the theme that's there. And but before I get into the first book I'll talk about, In the Heart of the Sea, I just want to expand a little bit where I began about how we came to Nantucket, because it was our moving to Nantucket in 1986 that really set me on the path that I've been following ever since. I was an English major in college. History was something that interested me, but it was not by no means the driving passion of my life. I got a master's degree at Duke. It was a PhD program, but I realized I was not cut out for academia. My father is an English professor at 91, living independently on the Cape. And I realized I didn't want to go that way. But when I took my oral examination at Duke, one of my books one of the books I was examined on was my favorite book of all time, Moby Dick. For me, another book I've written, a small book called Why Read Moby Dick? For me, Moby Dick is America's Bible. And you could argue Melville saw all of this coming in Ahab. Ahab is one of those characters that gets, timelessly, he connects with what's going on at all times. And you could argue we are in the grip of an Ahab right now. And Moby Dick was the lens through which I was introduced to Nantucket. And I was very excited. As I said before, we had not spent any time on Nantucket, but I was very excited to come here because I had read about Nantucket in chapter 14 of Moby Dick. And I became quickly fascinated with Nantucket's history. What was Nantucket really like? It was a real blow to me when a couple of years into this process, I learned that Melville had not even visited Nantucket when he wrote Moby Dick. He did visit Nantucket, but it was the summer after writing Moby Dick. Can you imagine that? Writing Moby Dick, the greatest novel, at least to my mind, of all time, having it drop like a stone. Critics hated it. No one read it. And then he comes the next summer on a supposed working vacation with his father-in-law, the circuit judge, and visits the holy ground of Moby Dick after writing that great novel. And so I became fascinated with the history of Nantucket. And I was at home with the kids, and so my time was limited. But it was finally our youngest, Ethan, it was in first grade, which gave me till 2:30 in the afternoon, and this was an incredible amount of time, and I began to work on what would be my first work of history, Away Offshore, a history of Nantucket. And this was the book with which I learned to write history, because I am not a professionally trained historian. I learned in the trenches, and I didn't know enough to understand how lucky I was to be on Nantucket, where incredible resources within an eighth of a mile of each other. The town building that has town meeting records from the 1600s, the Nantucket Historical Association that has logs, journals, letters, just incredible. And then the Nantucket Athenaeum, our library, which has a similar treasure trove of documents. And these were all within basically a town block. And I dove into those primary sources and began to see a history of Nantucket that I had never read about before. It was much darker than I had been led to believe. The standard story of Nantucket was an island of Quakers who were, abolitionists and yet whalers that were some of the greatest hunters and explorers the world has ever known, and that's absolutely true. But there was a dark side to this Nantucket miracle, and so that was what fueled my interest in Nantucket in Away Offshore. And one of the chapters is about the Essex disaster, in which a Nantucket whale ship was rammed and ultimately sunk by a whale. Excuse me. And it was, and I learned about Captain Pollard, who was the young first-time captain, and his first-time mate Owen Chase, and that was all and good. But I then went on to a book called Abram's. One of the things when I finished Away Offshore, and what it is, I'm a journalist by training. And journalists create a sense of life as lived in this moment. And what I brought a sort of journalistic sense to my telling of history. It's narrative nonfiction, it's history. I'm interested in creating a sense of life as lived in the past. And in Away Offshore, I focused each chapter on a specific character. And through the life of that character moved the history of the island forward. And one of the frustrations I had when I finished the book was Nantucket was a profoundly native place when the English arrived. There were an estimated 3,000 native peoples on Nantucket when the first 100 English settlers arrived. And there would be more native peoples on Nantucket, more Wampanoags, until the 1720s. More than 70 years after the establishment of the white community. And so this was a very native place in many ways, and yet I was frustrated by the lack of written evidence. And so that inspired me to work on another book, Abram's Eyes, which is the native legacy of Nantucket, exploring the oral traditions that have been passed down, speaking to Wampanoags, on the Cape and Islands, and really trying to establish this. And little did I know that this would really be a warm-up for my book, Mayflower. But then in 1997, this was the idea for In the Heart of the Sea hit me. What do Nantucketers do for a summer vacation? Well, the Philbricks charter a sailboat in Maine and go for a week's sail. And in the summer of and I brought 2 books with me. This was the summer of '97, was the summer of survival tales, and I brought Into Thin Air and The Perfect Storm. And it was while reading those at sea with my family that I began to realize, wait a minute, the ultimate survival tale is the tale of the Essex. It's not just the story that inspired the climax of Moby Dick, because it did inspire that. Melville read Owen Chase's account of the Essex disaster while working on Moby Dick. It's not just the inspiration for this great work of literature. It really begins with the sinking of the Essex and the survival tale that followed. And so I began to think of the Essex disaster not as a piece of Nantucket whaling's past, but potentially a story that could have a survival tale that could that gets at the ultimate human condition. I begin, what was going on with the starvation, the dehydration they experienced once they took to the whale boats. And I had all these questions, what was the whale thinking when it attacked the ship? All of this thing. So I started researching it, the tale from basically a scientific point of view. I began to realize, whoa, I want this story I want someone in Iowa who has never seen the ocean to read the first paragraph and to say, whoa, I want to pursue this. And so this became what would become In the Heart of the Sea. And it was for me, it was in many ways the book with which I found In the Heart, Away Offshore had been the book where I established my method. This book was in many ways the book with which I began to establish my voice, because I realized I had I wanted to include the scientific research, but also keep the narrative grounded in the past, in what was happening to the 20 crew members of the Essex in their whaleboats as they desperately tried to make their way towards the coast of South America. And the research was a continual surprise. I would learn, well, if you're interested in discovering what happens with starvation, well, during World War II, the University of Minnesota sponsored a starvation experiment that was run by Ansel Keys, who invented the Cape ration, and who would also be the first one to sort of establish that cholesterol was a bad thing and come up with the Mediterranean diet. And the great fear during World War II, particularly at the end of it, was that, yes, Hitler will fall, but most of Europe will be starving. How will we deal with that? And so this experiment, using conscientious objectors who volunteered to be clinically starved, not to death, was there. It's a 2-volume record of what happened. It's just an incredible document that gave me also, an into what the Essex survivors were experiencing. They described what was going on, but this helped me establish what was going on in terms of their bodies, their psychology, all of this. And since you all have a hospital affiliation, I have to say my doctor, Tim Lepre, here at Nantucket Cottage Hospital, he's been my personal physician, but he's also been kind of a research consultant throughout. And his sister-in-law was the head nutritionist at the library, and I enlisted her help in establishing, how the men in the whaleboats took to their whaleboats with Galapagos tortoises that they had collected in the Galapagos Islands, and they would ultimately eat those. Without those tortoises, they wouldn't have survived. So how many calories if you eat a Galapagos tortoise? And all of these kinds of things. Beth helped me come up with all this. And so In the Heart of the Sea for me was an amazing experience, and a real narrative challenge, going from the scientific stuff to the historical narrative that was following. And I found that the historical information could actually, the scientific information could actually help create tension you know something bad is about to happen. Well, let me tell you the science of really what's going to happen. And so that book for me was a very harrowing, but immensely, ultimately rewarding process. But and now I will shift gears to Mayflower. And by the way, last year was the 200th anniversary of the sinking of the Essex, on November 20th, and last year was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. And the Mayflower, I have to say, I never thought I would end up writing a book about the Pilgrims. Like most of you, I grew up participating in Thanksgiving Day pageants, and I thought of the Pilgrims as people with funny shoes with buckles on them and hats and all that kind of thing. And the story of leaping from the Mayflower to Plymouth Rock and the first Thanksgiving and all of this. But it was while researching away offshore that I realized I had to, if I was going to put Nantucket in its proper context, I had to look into the history of New England. And while doing that, I picked up for the first time William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, and I quickly realized it's an incredible book. It's to my mind, bar none, the greatest work of literature and history in 17th century America. And these were people. These were not caricatures. Describing and huge conflict. It was not this love fest of the first Thanksgiving with the English and the Wampanoag. There was much more to it than that. There was negotiation, there was diplomacy, and there was great fear on both sides. And so I realized this is a story I need to tell. And it had been through Abram's eyes that I had realized that I wanted to tell this as best I could. Also, getting into what happened to the native peoples, because in the Nantucket town building, there is a town meeting for 1665, I think it is, before the outbreak of what would become King Philip's War. King Philip's War was fought from 1675 into 76. And Philip was the English name for Metacom, the leader of the Wampanoag. And Philip had come to Nantucket beforehand, and I wanted to find out why. Had he come all the way from his home in what's now the Barrington Warren area of Rhode Island to Nantucket? And that set off my realization: wow, if I told the story of the Mayflower and the English interaction with Massasoit, Philip's father, who was the head of the leader of the Wampanoag at the time of the Mayflower's arrival. It's not just the story of the first Thanksgiving, because what I began to realize in researching the history of Nantucket was King Philip's War, what would erupt with the second and third generation, in which all of the promise of that first Thanksgiving, and really an incredible 50 years in Plymouth Plantation, in which Native and English people would coexist. It wasn't perfect by any means, but both groups worked very hard to keep the peace, because they both realized at the early going that they needed each other. The English were helpless on the coast. They would have died that first year if not for Massasoit deciding to establish diplomatic relationships with them, and through Squantum, who acted as an interpreter, a Wampanoag who had been abducted in a previous English by an explorer, taken to Spain, and ultimately England and London, learned English, and then ended up back, only to discover that his hometown in Patuxent, what the Pilgrims would call Plymouth Harbor, a community of 2,000 Wampanoag, had when Squanto returned just a year before the arrival of the Mayflower, that 2,000 person community was no longer, because what he discovered was that in the 2 or 3 years while he was away, a series of epidemics spawned by the English had, here we are in the midst of our global pandemic. Well, what the native peoples along the coast experienced makes this look like, a walk in the park. In some cases, 80% fatalities. When the Pilgrims came to Patuxent, now what they called Plymouth, the only thing left, the land was still cleared for agriculture, which the Pilgrims saw as a blessing. But the only real evidence of the previous occupiers were the whitened bones of the dead. And this was where the Pilgrims, in search of religious, I won't say freedom, because they would not allow religious freedom to others, but the ability to worship as they wanted to. This was where they built a home. And so this became for me a story full of dimension and eerily foreseeing what would happen in this country's future. And I realized, yes, there is the first Thanksgiving, but there is what would happen with the next generation, with the outbreak of King Philip's War, when Metacom Philip would, by that time, the second generation of English did not recognize their native allies as essential to their well-being. They saw them as possible impediments to their prosperity, because now, instead of their souls, they were interested in making finding more land for themselves, because they were the Pilgrims were tremendously prolific, and they needed more land for their next generation. And so that next generation that had grown up without the trauma and fears that went with the arrival of the Mayflower began to have a different attitude. And it also was on the native side, where Massasoit had decided, it was a very calculated decision on Massasoit's part, because his people had been decimated by the diseases. But their greatest rival, the Narragansett, on the other side of what we call Narragansett Bay, had been left untouched. And so in the months before the Pilgrims' arrival, it was looking like the Narragansett were going to take Massasoit and the Wampanoag over. And so what he decided was, this is a pitiful settlement of English people, but they have a technology that perhaps will be useful for us in stemming the threat on the other side of the bay. And so that had inspired Massasoit's alliance, but Philip Metacom had begun to see things differently, as he would say to the Plymouth leaders. And by this time, William Bradford, who had been the governor of Plymouth Plantation for much of his life, who had recognized that the native allies were essential to the well-being of the colony, was long gone. And it was Josiah Winslow, son of Edward Winslow, who had operated really as the diplomat for Plymouth Colony. Josiah had a very different attitude, and he was pushing it in terms of land. But Philip's young warriors were saying, wait a minute, what good is this alliance doing us? They're taking we're losing our land, getting nothing in return. In the beginning years of Plymouth Plantation, the native peoples had furs, the fur industry, with which to get English goods, beaver pelts and things like this. But those were quickly hunted out. And so in the next generation, the only thing they had that the English valued was their land. And this turned into a terrible series of decisions on both sides that would lead to the tensions that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of King Philip's War. And King Philip's War, people in New England may know about it, but beyond that, very few people do. And it is it is the bloodiest war fought in North America that we know of. Yes, this is in terms of population, percentage of population killed. Yes, there were more, there were more people killed in the Revolution and in the Civil War. But when you look at the percentage of people killed, King Philip's War was more than twice as deadly as the Civil War to the English population. But then you look to the native side, and that's just a drop in the bucket of what would happen to them. It would, in some instances, 60 to 80% would be either killed or decide to leave, to move away, or in some cases enslaved. Because one of the great revelations for me was the Pilgrim story is also ultimately leads in the second and third generation to the story of slavery in America and New England, because the Josiah Winslow and his council decided, as the war broke out and they became terrified that they would have to retreat to the Boston area, build a wall around Boston, and basically turn over the rest of New England to native peoples. As they feared this, they decided that any Wampanoag captured will be determined to be traitors and sentenced to perpetual slavery in the sugar plantations of the West Indies, the Caribbean. And so my preface to Mayflower begins with two voyages. I think the two voyages, I think, is the title. Where, yes, there's the voyage of the Mayflower, but there's the voyage in 1676 of the Seaflower, in which more than 100 Wampanoags would sail in chains, would sail from Boston, bound for the West Indies. And so I began to see the story as multi-generational, that would begin with the voyage of the Mayflower, but would ultimately end with King Philip's War, and I think, and an arc that would foretell what would be the process of America's march west, as conflict would follow the supposed frontier as it moved to California. And so that became what I wanted to achieve with that. And so it was a book for me that got really to that whole situation I keep finding fascinated by, of what do people do in the worst of times. And that led me actually to, and I'll speak briefly before we'll turn it over to questions, but that's also what led me to write Bunker Hill and get me into the Revolution, because I'd never intended to write 3 books about the Revolution. What interested me was I wanted to find out what happens when a revolution is unleashed. We were in the depths of the Iraq War, and trying to spread the miracle of revolution to the rest of the world to create these blessedly democratic results. And I wanted to sort of see, well, what was it like in the revolution? Because I think we have a tendency to think we're different here. Our revolution wasn't like France's. There was no violence. It was eloquent speeches in the halls of Congress, of the Continental Congress, that then suddenly led to the shots fired, that led to from one thing to the next, to the miracle of Yorktown, and here we are, this country created by a revolution with minimal conflict. Baloney. And what I really wanted to get at with Bunker Hill and the rest of the trilogy was that this was a revolution, and it was a bloody revolution. And I found myself realizing, I don't know what side I would have been on when it came to this revolution. The Loyalists had some real points when it came to all of this. And so I looked to the revolution in Boston as I wanted to see what this community of Boston experienced in this terrifying situation of a revolution. And what really led me to it was on Nantucket. I live on an island of about 15,000 people year round. Boston, at the time of the revolution, was a 1.1 square mile island with about 15,000 people on it. And having lived on Nantucket for 30 some years, when you live with a group of 15,000 people, you don't know them all by name, but you pretty much recognize everybody. You see them in the grocery. Well, now you don't, because everybody has a mask. But life is very personal, and for good and for bad. And so I really wanted to, with Bunker Hill, explore what happens in a revolution. And I have to say, and this in closing before I turn it over to the questions, is this yesterday, and this whole last couple of months, I feel like we're living in one of my books. And one thing I have realized, that the more you experience history as it was lived, the less clarity there is. And with that, I'll send it over to Myra.
Wow. My sister and I are here together, and she just said to me, I could listen to Nat all day. I want to know, where are you collecting all this information? Are you relying on written accounts? What is the source of all the information you use for your books?
Books, well, I don't make anything up. So it's all written down, and so except the oral traditions I use are the ones that were recorded in the past when it comes to native stuff, which is frustrating because you, by definition, then have an intermediary that can mess with it. But yes, so I am relying on the documents. But I have to say, my method is such that I have to go to the places. I really research trips are very important to me, and it's part of the process by which I can, particularly with the trilogy, it was the process by which I could viscerally understand it, because I think yes, intellectually we can know history, but it means nothing to you unless you have some kind of emotional connection with it. And for me, that's the important of as important when it comes to the past as anything, is that you have some sense, unless you can connect to it emotionally, it really is meaningless to you. And the danger then is to not just see it as a version of what you're living now, but to do honor to how different it was in the past, because that's the thing. Otherwise we can look at the past and say, what were they thinking, those idiots? We can, that is so naive to think that we have learned anything from the past. We're just reliving a 21st century of the past.
Loop. Yeah. I have 4 questions so far. The first one comes from Doug Fitzsimmons, and I'll read this to you. As I understand it, in the late 1800s, the heart of New England whaling shifted to New Bedford, due largely to the heavy silting of the Nantucket Harbor. What have you come to know about the responses of the Nantucket community to that shift? A shift I assume had been traumatic.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It really wasn't the silting of the harbor. I mean, that is a common misconception. There was a pre-existing bar that if you come to Nantucket today, there is 2 jetties, the East and West Jetty. And what they do is help take the channel over the Nantucket bar. And the bar runs like a bow. If you think of Nantucket as a crescent, the bar runs across, and it's shallow at the bar. And so that existed at the beginning of Nantucket. That's always been there. And when the whale ships were smaller, it wasn't a big deal. They could get over it at high tide. But as the ships got bigger and bigger, it became more and more of an issue. And what that forced them to do was to get lighters, which would mean they would actually offload their oil onto smaller vessels until and take it across the bar until the ship came up far enough, got light enough that it could then go over the bar. There was even the invention of the camels, 2 sort of wooden water wings that were sunk around a ship. The ship was brought in it, sort of like a dry dock, a floating dry dock. The ship would be brought in, they would pump out the water, and they would lift the ship up, and they could take the set of wooden water wings. They could take the fully loaded ship over the bar. I mean, incredibly time-consuming and expensive, but they were willing to do that. And but even before all of this, this is happening in the 1840s. By this time, even well before this, in the previous century, Nantucket's foremost whaling merchant, the Roach family, realized, this harbor is going to be limiting at one point. So they began to buy land over on the mainland, which they then called New Bedford. So Nantucketers can, it's New Bedford's really a satellite of Nantucket. No, I'm sure I know New Bedforders have a very different view of it, but Nantucketers saw the writing on the wall, and and these Nantucketers are very cagey, very sophisticated people. This was the first global economic force America knew. This was, they were going out around the world, killing whales, turning it in. This is before petroleum. They were turning, the blubber into the great oil that would, the spermaceti candle was the finest light that could be created. So these guys were very sophisticated. They not only, sent out the ships, killed the whale, they also sent it out. And so it was a vertically integrated economic entity. And these guys understood what was limiting. And so by the 1840s, originally Nantucket, being an island, was not an impediment. It was an advantage, because the way you got goods to market was by sea. You didn't go overland because roads were terrible. And so the sea was the I-95 of America into the middle of the 19th century. But the only thing that changed that was the railroads. And so as railroads came in, it became obvious to everyone that between the bar at our harbor mouth, and the railroads, Nantucket's days are numbered. And so, the Roach family by that point had moved over to New Bedford. You can still go, if you go to New Bedford, the Roach family house is a mansion open to the public. At least it was. I'm not sure what the policy is now, but they saw it coming, and so there was an element of concern, but many Nantucketers would invest in the cotton mills of all the whole mills that would then take off throughout New England. And then the Nantucket in 1846 had the Great Fire, which burned a third of downtown, all of the waterfront. Nantucket still had plenty of economic force behind it, began to rebuilt almost immediately. I think one of the reasons why downtown Nantucket was still around when Walter Beinecke began to turn it into a summer resort. The only reason it was still around was because they rebuilt in brick in 1847. But after that, the Nantucketers realized, the writing is on the wall. And then there was the discovery of gold in California in 1848. And so what the Nantucketers did was they filled up their whale ships with prospectors, sailed them around the Horn, and abandoned them in the Golden Gate. And it's estimated 3/4 of Nantucket's voting population was lost in 9 months to the gold fields. There was a part of San Francisco known as New Nantucket. And to this day, if they're building a new building downtown San Francisco, they come across the bones of an old Nantucket whaler. And so, these Nantucketers basically evacuated the island. The population would go from 10,000, at the height, to 3,000 in a decade, basically, and would stay at that until 3,000 for another 100 years. And so Nantucket became basically a town in mothballs. It was without, there were summer people, but summering was 2 months a year. And people, there's a lot of old time Nantucket summer people will look with great affection to the old times, but knowing a lot of year-round Nantucketers, the Egan Maritime Institute, which I was the founding director of, Bud Egan, who was ran the Marine Home Center. It was sort of Home Depot on Nantucket. He grew up in the 20s, and he said Nantucket, it was basically we made 10% less than the Cape, and everything cost 10% more. We were, it was that bad. And then only as it became, now everything is shifted with the invention of tourism. So
I have many more questions for you. Let's try to go through them quickly, if you don't mind. John Vanderslice says, will your research into Washington's travels be your next book? Is that what you mentioned earlier? And
yes.
what would the title be?
The title is Travels with George. I'm inspired by John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, which is my favorite book of all time, other than Moby Dick. But it's Travels with George, and it's our journey and George's journey. And it will be coming out mid-September of 2021. So
great.
So look for it, please.
Okay, a friend of mine, Hillary Hopkins, who, when I told her you were coming on, said, "Oh, I have all of his books." She writes, "I'm suddenly thinking about your journalistic and literary viewpoint and Ken Burns' visual work." Would you say something about that, or is she way off base?
No, not at all. I grew up loving movies, so it's kind of a cinematic. When I'm channeling those primary sources, I'm seeing, I don't know, I'm not seeing not seeing a tableau, it's stuff happening. And so a cinematic sense is been a part of what I do. And I think it's no accident that Ken's brother, Rick Burns, who worked with Ken on the Civil War and then has gone on to make his own films. I've done 2 films with Rick, one about In the Heart of the Sea, both PBS American Experiences, and then one about the Mayflower. And yeah, so I think that's a very legitimate parallel.
And this will be our last because we're getting close to the 12 o'clock time, and I thank you so much. But Nina Burr asks, even without the perfect clarity you wish you had from your study of history, where do you see this country going in the next few years? That's an easy one.
I don't know. To be honest, I have hope. I have hope we've reached, I mean, what I've seen looking at the past is America is zigzag. It's not a straight course to getting better. It's not, what we're always trying to do is fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all of us are created equal. And, it began with that as the rhetoric, but not the reality. And with each generation, America has been getting closer to that, but never getting there. And I don't, nothing is perfect in life. And to get there, though, it's not this, it's this, it's this. It's overreactions on all sides as the democratic process, as, it's as close to combat as people can get, this is how the political system works. It's frustrating, it's terrifying. But it's the best political system anyone has ever invented. We've been around a long time. And this is a terrifying and horrifying place, but it is my hope, passionate hope and ultimate belief that it is part of the zigzag and that it's not going to be this great, suddenly we figured it out. It's going to continue to be harrowing and frustrating. But I have faith, things will, if not get better, America will continue to strive to get better.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That is a perfect ending to an amazing hour with you. Thank you for your time. Enjoy your day. Stay off CNN and NBC, which I think everyone was happy to have an hour off from and listen to your wonderful stories.
Well, thank you, and give my best to Donna.
I will.
And thank you to Mount Auburn Hospital for everything.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye.
I'm going to say a few more things to my audience. So thank you so much. Next week, our speaker is Thomas Apt, who is the author of Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence. His presentation will be in a conversational format with the Chief of Police from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Branville Bard, being the person in conversation with Thomas. I want to share our huge thanks to Dale Manukin, our speaker chair, for her we couldn't figure out exactly how many years, but we think it's close to 20 years of inviting the speakers in our mission to support the hospital. And finally, there were some glitches about how to make sure you were on the call today. So look out each Monday. Everyone on our email list will receive an email with a link to that week's talk. And finally, if you haven't made a donation yet, there's a link on the email that you can do that with as well. Enjoy the day, stay well, wear your mask. We'll see you next week. Thank you.